Welcome, everyone, to this week's edition of Check-In with the Doctor. I am your host, Chris Dwight, and I'm particularly delighted to welcome this week's guest. It's actually someone I've gotten to know on both a personal and professional level. He is the Global VP of Sales Engineering with MRI Software. He has been with some very marquee companies such as Marketo and some others. He's an active member of the pre-sales community and a pretty regular voice in the pre-sales world. Mr. David Marsh. David, thank you so much for being here. Good to see you, my friend.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris. Super excited to be here today. Always look forward to our conversations. I've got some amazing stuff from you, and of course, you've introduced me to a ton of great people in the community. So it's always a good time. So thank you for having me.
Man, it's a delight. By the way, I'm glad you got the memo on the shirt.
Yeah, I noticed that.
You're the first person that's actually, followed my, attire recommendation. So I'm giving you extra bonus points on that.
Thank you. I need the bonus points up front.
Well, and so actually, before I even get into it, David, take a minute and introduce yourself in the unlikely event. And by the way, if we do have anybody who has joined, I want to say hello and welcome. I know sometimes people sort of trickle in. And if we do have anybody who has joined on the recording, welcome. I hope you'll hang around and listen for a few minutes. To anybody who might be listening, Dave, do you mind introducing yourself, sir?
Absolutely. So as you did a great job already, I'm leading the global sales engineering team at MRI Software. It is a real estate software as a service company that is growing rapidly through acquisitions. We're up over 50 in the last 5 years. And it's been a ton of fun. I've been there a little bit over a year now, and I was brought in to build and scale the team as we go through this rocket ship of hypergrowth, hopefully with a happy exit at the end of all this and creating more value for shareholders and everyone that we deal with. So I'm very excited about the role I'm in, the team that I'm working with now, and my background that you mentioned directly played into that. So from my experience at Marketo, going from a public company to, acquired by Vista Equity Partners and then sold 3 years later to Adobe, learned a lot along the way, had a lot of fun along the way, and definitely picked up a few things here and there. And it's something that I think about all the time. This, we talk about, how can we do different things better? How can I learn from other sales leaders? How can we advance the state of knowledge in the community? So, I'm really happy with all the things I see going on in the community, from pre-sales collective to all the companies getting funding for pre-sales tool stacks that we just didn't have before, right? And people are seeing that there's a need and there's enough growth out there to support the growth of these companies. So, my immediate previous experience was Marketo Adobe, but before that, I was in the fintech industry. So, I was with First Data, the world's largest credit card processor. Learned a lot about credit cards and interest rates and payment instruments and things there. I did some time before that with RSA Security and EMC, learning the cybersecurity world and compliance and security event management monitoring type solutions. And then, also had some time at Cisco. So I saw their acquisition machine working very, very well, and kind of first heard about the concept of a flywheel. I know that's something that maybe we'll touch on later, but moving from different industries and seeing some world-class enterprise software providers and SaaS providers, how they do things, I've started to notice that there's some similarities.
Yeah, and what a great background. Cisco, the cybersecurity world, fintech, and then Marketo, obviously. I mean, that was a rocket ship. And now MRI, and I know you've learned things along the way. Incidentally, David, let me interrupt just for a moment. Sam McKenna is with us, and she joined in. I don't know if you caught, she was one of my guests previously, and if you haven't checked out #SamSales, folks, she and her team are fantastic in what they're doing. Sam, it's good to see you. Thanks for saying hello.
Good to see you.
And I know it's just been such a journey for you. How did you start in sales engineering? How did you discover the role to begin with? Because so many of us have sort of an interesting story just how we got into the position to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely not intended. I never knew that sales engineering existed. And, it's funny. I just wonder, with all the activity in the space, how long it's going to be until you can actually get a degree and plan to be a sales engineer all the way from high school, right? Yeah. So in my case, I was actually doing desk side IT support for a law school in Atlanta, John Marshall Law School. And, learning about how to support networks, how to support, printers. The Apple stuff back then was a nightmare to support, but, I've grown to love all that. But through that process, working with our vendors and figuring out, how do I support the community of the law professors as effectively as possible and the students. I started going through my Microsoft and Novell certifications and working towards the networking side. And we happen to have a very personable Cisco sales engineer at the time, Mike Lundy. And he's like, if you're looking to make a change, we actually have this role called sales engineer. And I was like, well, what is it? I know that I call you whenever I have technical questions. I don't call the sales guy, and you always help me out. But I mean, does it pay well? What's the story here? And obviously the answer was yes. I made the move. He, spoke highly for me. He was my first manager in the sales engineering role, and turned into a great thing for me. But, I approached it with a lot of trepidation. And for anyone that watches this later or is listening now, right, we all have different perceptions of what sales is. And to your point in your book, right, 6 Habits, it is essential that we understand we are part of the sales team, but our mind needs to be right about what value we're bringing. Because in my mind, it was always, hey, I don't want to be a used car salesman. I don't want to browbeat people into buying things that they don't need or want or use. And then I started to understand, especially with complex software and complex technology, people want help, and they want somebody that gives them the skinny and helps them implement their solutions and solve their business problems, but they don't want to be pushed, right? People don't want to be sold to, they want to buy. And getting to that point and understanding that it's really about helping people and helping them implement the things that they buy or do things in a better way, right? Implement a new process and really scale up something was kind of an epiphany for me. And once I got into that role and I saw how different people did the role, it really made me feel good that I'm able to help people be successful, grow my career, and do all that in this role that I had no idea even existed.
Honestly, David, we could stop the recording right now and just put a bow on it, because what you just said is so powerful and it's so right. And I've been saying this for years. To sell is to serve at the end of the day. And so many of us get into, because we come from a technology background and we have sort of this perception of what it means to be in sales, which is the used car salesperson. And it's the wrong perception, right? I think where we are a little bit reluctant. And then when we get into it and realize that it really, the less, even though we need to accept that we're part of sales, the less salesy we are, the better off we're going to be. So you've entered this field, you start to figure it out a little bit. At what point did you know or feel compelled to move more into a leadership role?
Well, once I realized, you go through the stage, I think everybody goes through the stage. There's things that you want to change and you have limited ability to affect that change. And you're like, well, if I move into management, I can fix everything. And of course, you figure out pretty quickly that's not the case. And just like, leading is not about telling people what to do. It's about, motivating them to get the shared results. you figure that those things out in stages, right? I'm not the fastest learner in the world, so I'm sure people figure it out faster than I did. But I started to notice that you could have more impact and get more results working through a team than you could individually, right? Because there's only so many hours in a day. Even if you stay up all night working on a project for a client, you know, you might not get it done by yourself. And obviously you have to ask other people to help you, which is good. And having the ability to ask across teams is even better for when you need to collaborate on a project. So eventually it sunk into me that you can have much more impact through leading a team than you can individually in most cases, right? Sometimes at Cisco, we had distinguished engineering roles that had tremendous influence on strategic deals and even the direction of the products. And I think that's something that's kind of an emerging trend in a lot of companies, is that you can remain an individual contributor and get very high up in the organization and have a lot of impact in the organization. And I love to see that, because we all have our opinions on what the product owner should be doing with the products, right? Should they have a different interface? Should they have different integrations, things like that? And, you know, that's a passion of mine, getting to the process and reporting that data and having a data-driven operating model so that you can go back to the product owner and say, look, this many deals are at risk because we don't have these features. This is what the numbers say. And it took me a long time to get that mindset, right? Because I always thought, well, we're the tip of the spear. If we tell somebody that one of the clients wants it, it's going to get done. And then I began to understand how many competing priorities there are, and how many people are like tugging at the product owners, right? Because you've always got the massive customers that generate a lot of revenue, and they yell pretty loudly in the squeaky wheel theory. But, you know, you may have thousands of customers that you could make happy with a feature that you could get done faster, right? So it's all about giving them the tools and giving them the data to be able to make better decisions. And I think the approach, it goes back to kind of mindset. I think your approach matures over time, and you realize that the best way to impact other teams is to bring them tools and data that will help them do their job better.
Yeah. And you said so many things, and I want to sort of double click on a couple times. You used the term mindset a couple times. And I know you talked about process and tools, and I know how much of an advocate you are for sort of building around that. Let's start with mindset, though, because I know that's one of the foundations for you. What do you believe are some of the foundational sort of mindsets that either the folks on the team and or you as managers have to have?
Absolutely. So mindset's something I think about a lot. You know, we've talked at some point. I hope to release a book and capture some of these thoughts. And as I've been going over how do I structure the content, how does it make sense to actually do this in real life, I keep coming back to mindset as kind of that keystone concept, because mindset is important because it's how you deal with adversity, right? And we all have adversity, whether it's from declining sales and all of a sudden now you've got pressure to reduce headcount on your team, or if you're in a fortunate position, you're having hyper growth. How do you make sure you're scaling the team to meet that incredible demand, right? And I think it all comes back to mindset. So mindset to me is your attitude, and how do you think about things, and how do your beliefs influence what you think about? Because what you think about influences what you actually do on a day-to-day basis. So I always, talk about, I like to read different books and talk about different authors. But to me, I think we can't really control what happens in life, whether that's in our personal life, professional, whatever, right? Nobody saw COVID coming, and, we have to deal with that. So the question is, what do you do about that? And how do you turn that into empower yourself and your team with a mindset that can deal with massive changes like that? And I always say that there's only three things we can control in life. We can't control what life throws at us, but we can control our attitude or our mindset. We can control the actions that we take on a daily basis. And then we can choose to respond how we want to any of these situations, right? Some companies came out of this challenge stronger than ever before, right? I've talked to a lot of great sales engineering leaders that adapted their tool set and their processes. So now they're better equipped to do these remote demonstrations and communicate more value through these remote demos than they were doing face-to-face, because you always had to worry about setting up the Wi-Fi at the client site. You had to worry about setting up the projectors. You had to have slides in case the Wi-Fi didn't go off, right? And we'll get back to some of that, but it allowed a lot of people to think about different ways to approach it and think about working on the solution and not necessarily the problem. And I think that's the first key takeaway from a mindset perspective is, what can you control in life? You need to focus on that there. And it's those three things, right? It's going to be your mindset, your actions, and how you choose to respond to things.
Yeah. There's so many things that you said just then that I love. First of all, I love the use of the word adversity, right? And you're right. It's so easy to think, I've got it all going on, right? When everything's good, right? And you probably don't necessarily need to check your mindset if life comes easy, but we know life doesn't come easy, right? So I think you're right. Mindset to me is sort of that anchoring foundation when things get difficult. The other word that I thought of when you were talking is it's how we interpret things, right? We were talking about how we respond, but I think what precedes that is how we interpret it. And I think I think our mindset sort of determines how we interpret certain things that we see and hear. And you're right. At the end of the day, all we can control is what we do and what we say.
Right.
And that's the response. So how does this begin to play into culture from your perspective?
Well, I think culture is important because it determines how your team does what they do when no one else is around, right? And I want to kind of dig into that, but the mindset, really, I think a growth mindset is the most essential tool that a sales engineer can have. And when I reference a growth mindset, it's how do you approach challenges, right? So you can have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. Fixed mindset is, hey, you're as smart as you're ever going to be. You're only going to be able to do so much. And, if it gets hard, people with a fixed mindset tend to quit, right? And they give up on those challenges. Whereas there's been a lot of research. The growth mindset is that, hey, challenge is good. Difficulty is good because it's going to make me grow personally. And I'm going to figure this out. And it's that resilience that we really need to have, because there's so many different things that can be adversity in a sales deal, right? It can be the competitor you're dealing with. It can be that they don't have the budget that they need. So you're going to have to either help them find additional budget from another department or make a business case so that they can buy your stuff. There's a lot of different things that you have to be flexible about and be able to adapt to. So I think that growth mindset is essential. And, having that promoted to the team and telling the team, hey, look, we need to approach things with a growth mindset is part of setting that bedrock for your culture. And I would say also being intentionally positive is a superpower for sales engineers, right? You need to think about, how do you fix this? What's the solution? Instead of fixating on, going back to some of my Marketo days, right? There's always some friction between salespeople. Normally it's new salespeople as they're learning their craft, and sales engineers tend to have more tenure, right? They see a lot of different salespeople come and go. And they have a lot of industry experience. So there's always going to be that friction as a sales leader of how do you pair up your people? How do you deal with it when there's friction between the internal team, right? The sales team and the sales engineering team. And it comes back to always assume the best, right? And don't take things personally. So that's what I mean by being positive. Some days are going to be bad. Everybody's going to have bad days, but how you respond to that again, and how do you, to your point, how do you interpret that in your mind is so important. Because is it, hey, the salesperson, was up all night with a sick kid last night, so they didn't prepare for the meeting? They weren't intentionally trying to blow up the meeting and put it all on you and say, hey, Chris, can you just, throw it to you at the first 5 seconds of the meeting and leave it all to you? You can debrief with them after and say, what was that? I thought we talked about this demo flow and you did something different. assuming that they aren't intentionally trying to make your life miserable. Because if you go down that other path and you say, this salesperson's the worst, I want you to talk to their manager, blah, 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 it just creates more friction, and it's a downward spiral. So that being positive as a foundation, I think, is super important for what we do, because we're called on to do so many different things.
Sure. Are there certain things, David, that you do as a manager, as a leader, to drive that growth mindset that you talked about within your teams? And if so, what are some of those things that you do?
I think in one-on-ones, it's very important to have that coaching mentality and to ask people about specific situations and how did they interpret that. And, if they saw there was a problem, how did they respond to that? So again, you go back to, okay, you've got a couple of choices in how we look at this, and we can assume the worst, and we can have internal battles going on between our sales team and our sales engineering team. Or we can go to the sales leaders and say, hey, we want you guys to sell as much as possible, because when you get paid, we get paid. So we want to support you. Never doubt that we want to support you. If we're saying no, there's a reason. It's either not a good fit for the client, or, it's clearly not an opportunity. The salesperson has happy years or whatever, right? They're seeing something that's not really there. It's an unqualified deal. And again, you take the personalities out of it as much as possible when there's the conflict, and you say, what's the best thing for the prospect? Not, right. My engineer has hurt feelings, or your salesperson has hurt feelings, although you will have those conversations. But I try to share perspective in my one-on-one, certainly with my leadership team. And then when I have skip level meetings with my sales engineering team, I also ask them to look at different situations and consider different possibilities. Maybe the person just hasn't had any training in a sales methodology, and they don't know how to do a good discovery.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe they used to work with a sales engineer that did all of that for them, right? And would do all the discoveries and then tell them what they needed to do for a demo. And it's not necessarily a problem with their initiative as so much as they've been trained that way. So, I would say the one-on-one coaching is extremely important to make sure that you're getting that mindset concept and the culture built out. And I'll go back to, culture is how you do things, right? So it's driven by your actions, not your words. You can have the greatest vision statement. You can have the greatest, you pay all these consultants to come in and do a vision and a mission and all this stuff. And people will ignore that all day long if that's not what your actions say, right? You get what you tolerate. So if you tolerate people not pulling their weight, and they're supposed to do, part of a big project, and they don't do what they're supposed to do, and nobody says boo to them about it, then they're going to assume that they can do that too and get away with it. So it's setting those standards, setting those expectations for behavior, and being intentional about it, right? So for me, every year, I also go through an annual planning process at the end of the year. And, we've used the Salesforce V2 MOM model and said, what do we want to accomplish this year? What are the specific projects that are going to help us get there? And how do we want to do it? What are our values as a team? So, MRI has great corporate level 5 core values. I love them. They're very good. But we also have team level values for how we want to treat each other in the team and how we want to interact with other teams.
Yeah. No, and again, you said so many powerful things there. So I'll just sort of double click on a few of them. One of the things that we like to talk about is true change happens one-on-one. And that's really what you're talking about there, right? Is that, look, and I run sales training and I work with a lot of people, but at the end of the day, true change happens managers and directors working directly with their people, right? That was the first thing I wanted to double click on. The second thing is these are my words, not yours. You kind of said, at the end of the day, talk is cheap, right? Like we need to walk our talk, right? And to me, there's nothing more powerful than leaders actually demonstrating the words that they're using and the advice that they're giving. So incidentally, David, let me pause this just for a moment and say hello to anybody who might be out there. We don't see you, so if you're there, you want to say hello, I encourage you to put a little comment in the chat and say hello. And of course, if you have any questions for David, please feel free. David, as you look back on some of the various roles that you've had, the leadership, the management roles that you've had, what, as you reflect, are some of the sort of the biggest maybe aha moments or sort of lessons that you've learned where you went into a situation, and I'm going to go back to the mindset. You went into a situation with one mindset and something significant happened and you went, wow, I need to change my mind. Because to me, our mindsets change in sort of those significant moments where we go in with one perspective and we realize along the way that we were just looking at it the wrong way. Do any sort of memories sort of jump to mind when I share that?
Absolutely. And, they say that the gift of failure, right? Failure is the best teacher. So a lot of these things go back to horrible decisions that I made or, horrible choices that I made, where when I came out the end of it, I was like, okay, I've still got a job. So that's good. I can learn from this, right? I can do this better next time. And it made me sit down and think about, are you getting what you want, right? Are you getting the results that you want? And that's such a fundamental question. And it's at the heart of so many different frameworks that, value reflection and thinking time and learning from your mistakes. But, just a couple of examples there. There have been interactions between salespeople and sales engineers where, I decided to take more of the friend angle and, say, so-and-so is being unreasonable and, they're not doing this and they're not doing that. And immediately the sales leader is defensive, the salesperson's defensive. I think one of the most impactful ones was where I went to a sales leader and I said, hey, my sales engineer said, the salesperson did A, B, and C, and we can't do it that way. And she came back and said, okay, well, my salesperson says, D, E, and F, and there was a good business reason for this. And she's really kind of upset that you didn't speak to her about it. And I was like, light bulb moment. No one likes you going to their manager if you haven't spoken to them first. So I try to set that as a bedrock principle for everybody. If they come to me and they say, hey, I've got a problem with so-and-so, my first question is always going to be, well, what did so-and-so say about it? Because you have told them, right? You wouldn't come to me and then have me go to their manager if you haven't addressed it with them, right? If it's repeated behavior and you've said something to them and they're not responding, absolutely escalate it. We'll all four have a conversation about it. But nobody likes you going straight to their manager and saying that you did something stupid without hearing their side of the story. So, it's such a cliche, but it's so true. There are always two sides to the story, and you need to encourage the team to go and hear that story and get that perspective. So, that was a key learning for me that I've taken through multiple teams and tried to instill, if you're not communicating, certainly with the people that you're working with in a revenue team, that's a problem, right? Communication has to be open and candid. And yes, people are going to get their feelings hurt. And sometimes people are going to be defensive. But again, you try to bring it back to that thought of what's the best thing for the customer here, right? Yeah. Are we doing the best job we can to give them the best demo experience that we can based on the time you're giving me to prepare, the time you're giving our team to respond to this RFP? Is this really, we're not going to do our best work with a 3-day deadline. So, don't put us in the position of having to do, work that's not going to be up to the experience we want to provide. And my whole thing in those situations, I lead a team that does the bid responses and RFPs as well, is if we're not being invited to this thing until a week before or 5 days before, how likely is it that we're truly in the loop on this deal? Do we have the relationships we need to be successful here? Or are we checking a box for somebody? So There absolutely, there should be a response, while a go, no go decision that sales engineering gets to weigh in on for any RFP, any bid, or even any sales deal, right? Ultimately, I understand that the salesperson is the quarterback of the deal. They're responsible for bringing that in, even if we have reservations sometimes. But we have to have the kind of relationship so we can go to them and say, these are our concerns, right? If you're going to proceed, but we want to be very clear that we have these concerns with the deal, and we think that we should be serving this other opportunity because it's a better use of our time and resources. And sometimes you've got to go along with it, but you've got to have the relationship so that you can have those conversations.
Starts with the relationship. It's got to be a two-way street. And at the end of the day, look, our role as a sales engineer is to put our best foot forward, right? I mean, that's our job. But we have to be given the resources and the time in order to do so.
Right.
Question for you. So what we're really talking about here is that sales SE relationship. If you were to sort of categorize all the sort of the big issues or the challenges that you sort of deal with on a regular basis, and the SE sales partnership were one category, would that be the biggest category, or are there a few other categories that sort of rise up in that sort of list?
I think friction is certainly something you need to figure out in your sales motion to minimize the friction between the teams, and understanding what the root cause of that, I think, is vitally important. And I think that any leader that goes in and tries to put in a data-driven system, data-driven operating model, like Adobe uses, anything like that where you're driven by the data, I think you need to understand the sales motion end to end to begin with, what those touch points are and why the sales team is running specific deal cycles a specific way, right? Is it because that's the sales methodology that we use? Or is it because they learned it that way? Was it organic, right? So it's kind of tying back to the culture thing. People, see what you do and then they do it the same way. And if you're not intentional and explicit about what you want from either a cultural perspective or how you run a sales deal, they're going to make up their own way to do it. They're doing the best they can, but if they don't have the guidance, you're going to get all kinds of stuff out there. So it may not be malicious. They just needed to figure out how to sell. And, they decided that badgering the customer with a checklist is the best way for them to do it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but hey, they're hitting their quota. Yeah.
Path of least resistance, right?
Yeah.
We're just going to get stuff done. Incidentally, I'm reminded of something I heard a while ago, and I think many of us have heard it, but data, not drama, right? Yeah. Let's focus on data, not drama. What advice do you have, or what advice would you give to someone who's relatively new to the role of a sales engineer leader or a sales engineer manager? And I know we've talked, and you mentioned the book that you're working on, and I know you have lots of thoughts, but what are some of the sort of the first kind of pieces of advice you give for people in that role?
I would say begin with the end in mind, right? Understand where you want to go, understand the process that you're going to need to get there. You may not have the funding right now to go out and buy a tool to sit on top of Salesforce. You might not even have Salesforce. There have been some really big organizations I know that are still driving forecasts through Excel, right?
Wow.
And that's real life. But what you need to figure out is, what do you need to be looking at? What kind of data do you need to be capturing? And from my perspective, I think both sales leaders and sales engineering leaders need to understand what is the demo demand, right? And what is the expectation for how many demos you're going to do a week? Can you say that, an average SE on your team, because of it depends on what you're selling and how long it takes to demo it, right? If you can get a demo done in 30 minutes, maybe you can do 5 demos a day. if it takes you 4 days to prepare and all day to demo your stuff, you're going to need more lead time. So you need to think about, how do you collect what the demand is? So how many demos are being requested per salesperson, and then follow that through to the end. So if you've got, salesperson A over here and they're requesting 10 demos a week, do they have a 50% win rate versus salesperson B that is requesting 20 and they're only winning 30% of their deals, right? You start to see the patterns of who's just throwing stuff at a wall and hoping that, a demo is going to bail them out versus who's managing their process. And then you can look at that as what good looks like. And you can say, okay, we want to see if we can have this person show everybody else how they do their discovery. And we want to use their discovery questions. So you can start to tease out value out of the data. But I would say start with an Excel spreadsheet if you need to. But just start tracking the demos that you're doing. I would say having some type of a score for the quality from the perspective of the pre-sales team is absolutely vital. If you have a concern about whether the solution is a fit, whether, it's a good industry, if you have pre-sales concerns, you need to condense that into a score, right? It can be super simple on a scale of 1 to 10. How good of a deal is this? Is it a 2? How many 2s are we chasing versus, this is a no-brainer. A lot of our clients look like this. We've got umpteen references we can give them. And, we should be chasing more of the 10s. And then you also have to factor in the deal size and the deal value, right? If your people are running ragged, I think this is really important. It's one of the quickest ways you can look to take pressure off the team is you start to look at ways to free them up for the higher value deals. Mm-hmm. So you've got to look at segmentation. Are you selling mid-market? Are you selling enterprise strategic? And those are going to be bigger deals, and you get more bang for the buck, right? Per hour of sales engineer time invested, you're going to get more revenue back, which is not to say that I don't love S&B. That was Marquetto's, bag. We were doing most of the revenue mix was S&B when I came into Marquetto. Yeah. And strangely enough, that was one of the funny conversations I had as coming in as a leader was I had a ton of enterprise experience coming out of an enterprise leadership role. And they were like, we've got really fast deal cycles. Are you going to be able to keep up with a 23-day average sales cycle? Yeah. Be able to manage that transactional business. And luckily, I figured it out. And the whole thing is you have to be able to go back to the data to say, we need to understand how qualified these deals are, and we need to know how the sales engineering team feels about it so that you're getting more information into that qualification process. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that I think Cisco did particularly well was we had Monday morning meetings with the entire sales team, the salespeople and the sales engineers, and we would do sanity checks, right? Nobody wants to throw their best buddy on the sales team under the bus. But if the, SVP of sales is saying, hey, Chris, how real is this deal? And you say they have zero budget or they have a guy in there that, he's married to somebody that works at our competitor. This is probably not a good bet, right? It gives the entire team more information to make better decisions with. So I would say for any new leaders, start tracking the data, even if it's in Excel. If you can get better tools, then absolutely, I would invest in anything that helps you automate that process, because the more admin time you can take off of your people putting stuff into a system, the more time they can be in front of customers selling things. Yeah. So that's kind of how I pull those things together.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, I mean, we were talking about prioritizing the customer. We also need to prioritize the company and what's in the best interest of the company, right? Incidentally, we just had a question from Matt Elsom. I don't know if you know Matt. He's one of the founders of Emma 3D. And this is precisely, I think, what you were just talking about, right? What's your experience of this score defined by SEs when you've got, desperate AEs, hunting for a deal? I mean, the way and by the way, I hear this in a lot of the workshops that I run, right? Where we're trying to support our sales folks and we're trying to have a voice and a seat at the table, but there are some AEs that are in a very bad place and they're just going after anything. So,
Right.
so sort of my interpretation of the question. And by the way, Matt, it's good to see you. I'm glad you joined. And he had a follow on. Could be that situationally is a good fit. Exactly. And you're right, Matt. AEs have a hard time accepting that. What thoughts do you have or advice do you give even to your team, David, when you face situations like that?
Absolutely. I think we all find ourselves in this situation at one point, and we've got, we may have the team fully booked up for demos for tomorrow, and all of a sudden a salesperson says, it's got to be tomorrow. The execs can only meet tomorrow. It's the only time in the space-time continuum that they're going to be able to meet that I can bring this deal in, and they're going to sign if we do a good demo, right? So you will be put in that situation at some point. And, my experience was that we weren't even scoring the deals at that point. So, I picked up the concept of having a tangible SE score later. I think a lot of it's going to depend on your relationship with the sales leader. I think if you've built that trust with them, they will take your word when you say, this deal is a non-starter, right? There's nothing going on there. You are going to get pressure from the sales leader to say, they don't have anything else in their pipeline, so they really need you to help us out on this one. Maybe it's going to be, exploratory, right? You will get in those situations, and sometimes you'll need to do those favors. But if it comes down to an absolute, we don't have the people to support the number of deals you're asking for demos on, I put it back on the sales leader. I'm like, look, we scheduled these. Your other salespeople asked for demos. We assume that those are good deals. We put them in the slots. So if you need to push something, we don't have the resources. We just don't have the people tomorrow. So I need you to prioritize for me. You look at your forecast and you tell me which one of these deals we need to push out another week so that we can take that time slot. And have them co-invest in that decision with you. Because the answer is not, we're going to be able to do everything. It's not going to be that way, right? Even the most well-resourced companies, there's going to be resource contention. So you need to go back and say, if it were me, based on what the team's told me, I think this deal's a waste of time, I would push it out a week, right? You can make that decision. We'll support what you say. I'm just telling you, I think you're not likely to hit your quarter number if you chase that deal.
Exactly. Well, and so two thoughts. I mean, first of all the folks that I work with, I say at the end of the day, we know what our sales counterparts are motivated by, and that's to close business, as they should be. I mean, it's their job and it's their objective, right? So I think if the more we can tie our agenda to their agenda, the better, right? On the flip side, the other thing that I tell certainly the folks that when I was managing is sometimes we have to take one for the team, right? I mean, we are going to be put in situations that are not perfect and not ideal. And that's just, sometimes it's just our job. Now we can't make we can't make a daily appetite of that, right? If this is the norm, then we have a problem, and let's have that conversation. But there are some times when we just got to take one for the team. And by the way, you mentioned the debrief. If we knew or we had a sense going in, this probably wasn't the best use of our time and probably the best qualified deal, and we get in there and we discover that we were right, then let's use that as an opportunity to come back and say, you know what, the next time I see these signs, I'm going to be a little less, eager to jump into that. Incidentally, Jeff Cordes is with us. Jeff, good to see you. And he was responding to Matt. But he said, that's where a solid SE can be the guidance, with the hope of encouraging or teaching and enabling our sales counterparts. To your point, a lot of times the sales engineers have more tenure than the folks that we're working with on the sales side, and we sort of are that foundation, which is a really good segue into your idea of the flywheel. So, you've shared this with me a little bit. Take a moment and sort of describe your sort of analogy with the sales engineer flywheel.
So the flywheel is pretty popular in digital marketing circles. HubSpot made it pretty popular, but Jim Collins mentioned it in his book Good to Great. And even 200 years ago, right, James Watt, that invented the steam engine, had this concept of a flywheel that could store energy and then release it. And the idea is kind of like the little wheel on your bikes these days, right? You have a small wheel that puts leverage into the larger bike and makes it go faster, builds momentum. The thought there is that pre-sales or sales engineering is that stored energy that actually accelerates and builds momentum with a sales pipeline, right? So by the way we impact deals and how we go in and we give our expert perspective, but we also have that, experience that we bring to the table. We help accelerate deals and bring them in faster. And I think it's critical. I think one of the biggest, if not the biggest value out of sales engineer brings to the table is the ability to grow deal sizes, right? Because they have that panoramic view of everything we can do as a company, they can position things that maybe the salesperson would not have thought of and grow the contract value.
And I certainly, I never want to steal any of your thunder, but I just love this idea that the pre-sales is the flywheel of the sales operation, right? Or pre-sales is the flywheel of the sales organization. And I love that notion of the stored energy, because you're right. And particularly as we're talking, let's be fair, AEs tend to come and go, right? I mean, sales is a very, sort of self-defining role in terms of hitting your numbers or not. I mean, that's just the reality of sales. And so, whereas the sales engineers, they tend to have a longer tenure. And you're right. I think we're the ones that sort of keep a steady pace, right? And when we're brought in, that's when we can add a significant amount of value. So, I just love that analogy, David. So David, I want to start to, we've already, if you can believe it, we've already been 45 minutes. So we've covered a great deal of ground. I do have a couple of questions that I'm gonna get to in a minute that you may not see coming. But before I do that, I want to make sure we've covered, sort of everything that you had on your mind. I know you're most passionate about building teams. We've talked a little bit about mindset, and the importance of establishing your mindset and building out the culture. I love that you said, for new managers, know your vision. And then what I really heard you say is almost reverse engineer the numbers that you need to get to that vision. And then therein sort of defines the data that you should be tracking. Anything else that's sort of on your mind that you care to share around building teams before we sort of move into our lightning round, if you will?
Sure. Just to kind of recap, right, for the takeaways, I think you have to start out with the mindset that you want the team to have. You want them to be resilient and relentless. And that forms the foundation for your culture for the team. So even though the broader company has their own corporate values, you also want to have team level values for how you do things and how you work together so that everybody steps up and helps the team when needed. And you have that psychological safety as a team that everybody is there to help you, right? And you build those relationships. And I think it's all interrelated, because the relationships that you need to build with the sales leaders so that they trust you when you come to them and tell them this is not a good deal to chase, right? You have to start early on that. And that becomes part of your vision of how do you want to interact with your peers and how do you want to interact with the sales leaders so that sales engineering is a trusted advisor rather than, demo monkeys working for the sales team, because that's not a productive situation for anybody. It builds resentment. And ultimately, again, it's not the best client experience when you're doing demos, because people can sniff all that stuff out. So I think all these things are related. And as you look to build and scale a team, you start out with the mindset, you define what type of culture you're going to have, and you're intentional about modeling that for the team, and you call it out and reward it when you see that behavior in the team. And, again, the takeaway on the mindset is you're not going to be able to control everything that happens, to your point, right? We're going to get pulled into deals that are highly speculative. We know they're not good, but we've got to work them anyway. But the attitude to take there is, let's gather data. So at the end of this, we can go back and say, these are our top wins and losses at the end of the quarter. Not I told you so that these deals sucked, but we put all of this hours and cost of sales into it, and we didn't get what we wanted. So next quarter, let's figure out a way to do that better.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, and I'm glad you mentioned that there at the end, because you're absolutely right. We don't want to make anybody feel embarrassed. It's not us versus them. Quite the contrary, right? I would approach that as, in the future, if I see signs or indicators that give me reason to believe that this might be a repeat of something we've seen before, is it worthwhile? Is it worth our effort and time for me to put that on the table and have a conversation? And what's the best way to communicate those concerns, right? So there's a way to have the conversation, but do so in a very respectful and collaborative manner, right? So, and again, it comes back to the mindset, right? I mean, and I'm a big mindset guy, right? And the first part of my mindset when I'm talking to sales engineers, and you touched on it, is you are in sales, right? Yep. That's step number one. Step number two, and again, as you well know, sales is a team sport. Absolutely. And that's really what we're talking about, right? So if we don't get anything else right, if we get at least those two things right in our mindset, we're ahead of the game, right? So, and incidentally, I know two of the other things that you're passionate about are process and tools, and I know we don't have time for that. So I'm gonna invite you back here on the spot to come back, before too long, and we'll have a focus on process and tools to kind of this. So this will be David Marsh part one, and then we'll have a David Marsh part two, because I'd love to. I know you've spent a lot of time working with some of the tool vendors in the space. You've put a lot of processes in place in there at MRI, so it would be worth having that conversation.
I'd love to.
So at this point, the landing gear is out, the runway is in sight, and we're going to land this plane on time. But I do want to ask you just a quick couple of questions. In fact, I have 3 questions that I ask people at the end of every one of these conversations. Here's the first. I'd like you to think back to a demo that you were involved in or actually delivering yourself that went horribly wrong. And if you can think of one, why? Why did it go so poorly?
Well, I have a selection to pick from, but I mean, going all the way back to my Cisco days, right? We were selling hardware, we were selling switches to a school district, and we went in and we just got hammered, and I got asked a bunch of questions that were clearly landmines that were supplied by the competitors. And it just didn't go well. We didn't have good answers. And what I took away from that was the value of preparation, right? And I really used to stress about how much am I prepared for demos. And there's a happy balance, right? And this goes away as you get more experience. A lot of things that used to really paralyze you when you were new in the role, you've had the questions, you've encountered those scenarios, you feel confident that you can adapt on the fly. But at that point, I was not at that point in my career. And I really took it hard. And one of my mentors at Cisco actually gave me some really good advice that stuck with me to this day. And he said, David, you don't have to know everything, but you have to know more than the customer. Right? You have to be adding value and insight in that conversation. And for me, we could have prepared better with the competitive positioning and understanding who was in the deal and how they were setting us up to fail. But I spent all my time preparing on technical specs and here's what we can do, and then got hit by a train called, competitive landmines.
And what you said is so powerful. We don't have to know everything, just know more than the customer, or know something that they don't that is beneficial to them. I love that. I love that. That's so fantastic. All right, question number 2. We're going to sort of reverse the order a little bit here. Have you ever been on the receiving end of a demo that was particularly good and particularly compelling? And if so, why?
Absolutely. Just a couple of weeks ago, right? I'm sure a lot of the sales leaders have people reaching out to them for all of these pre-sales tools and sales tools that are in market right now. And I actually think it's an interesting exercise. Me and a few of my leadership team were on a couple of demos a couple of weeks ago, and it was a night and day contrast between the good vendor and the bad vendor. And we were all, chatting with each other as clients do during the demo, saying, this is for the bad one. This is terrible. They didn't establish the need. They're assuming that we're going to buy it or, do another demo, even if this goes badly. And, it's tough, right? Because you're presenting to people that present all the time. And then in contrast, the person that did the best job, the person that didn't do such a great job was an actual account executive doing their own demo. And they were going down a script, and you could tell they were going down a script, and they didn't pivot well when we brought up some concerns. The one that went really well was actually an SDR, a sales development representative. And she was phenomenal. She anticipated questions we were going to ask. She dropped examples of other people that had had success doing it. She was not hard selling us. She was like, hey, I really think this can help you out with this use case that we talked about. Just really advanced skills. And we were like, wow, if she's that good as an SDR, what is the sales team and the sales engineering team like? Right? So you absolutely see things in the industry, and you're like, wow, I have a lot more respect for that company just because of the way they ran the sales process. Yeah. Not even if they have the best technology, but just the way they ran the sales process.
Yeah. Well, it's such a good reminder that the best product doesn't always win. Oftentimes the best demo does, and certainly the best the customer experience or buyer experience. So yeah. And what I hear is that the one that was most compelling and engaging felt like it was being presented to you, for you, right? And not just for them, just going through a script and checking off a box, right? You're actually presenting something to me, making me feel understood, and you're showing me things that you think will be useful for my business, right? And by the way, I do think it's interesting. There's a lot of, because there are so many companies entering this pre-sale space, they're giving demonstrations for people that give demonstrations, right? So I actually think it's a very interesting challenge. In fact, I think it'd be a good exercise to have. It would be, this would be a good takeaway. I may post this on LinkedIn afterwards, is to have your sales engineer team sit through demos from other vendors. That would probably be very, very powerful. So, all right, David, by the way, do you have a hard stop at 1 o'clock? Because I want to be respectful of your time.
I do, actually. I've got a one-on-one that I've got to jump on, but okay. I really appreciate the time today.
So in that case, you're getting off the hook of answering my last question. But since I'm going to have you back, I'll ask my last question the next time we visit. So with that then, David, thank you so much for being here today. Just some great ideas. I know people can reach out to you on LinkedIn and find you there. And any other closing comments to you before we wrap it up?
I just appreciate the opportunity to have the discussion. Like I said, I always learn new things from you, learn things from other people in the community. I think the community is really taking a lot of steps forward, sharing knowledge, people learning from what other people have been through. And, I'm a lifelong learner, so I love meeting new people. I love learning things from them. I love helping other people avoid some of the landmines that I've stepped on. So absolutely, anyone that wants to reach out, please reach out on LinkedIn, shoot me a note. I'm happy to help.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And Matt and anybody else who may have joined, thank you so much. And anybody who listened to the recording, David, thanks, man. It's been great to visit with you. I know I'll talk to you shortly, and I'll have you back to the show not before too long.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody.
Bye all.